Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This is another one of my viewer request reviews, and this time I'm going to be talking about Episode 1 of Season 1 of The X-Files, as was requested by Downey Thor 21. I hope I'm saying that right. Anyway, this was the first thing X-Files that I've seen since the first X-Files movie, Fight the Future, came out, I think it was 2003. So while watching this, really my main feeling was nostalgia. Like X-Files was something that I watched regularly all throughout high school and college. So going back here and watching this first episode again, it really was like taking that trip back to the fall of 1993. And yeah, it just was really a very nostalgic trip back to the 90s for me in a lot of ways. And it was also something that really got me thinking a lot about the legacy of the X-Files and the show's influence, very long-lasting, very deep influence on modern television. But I'll get into that later. Right now, let's just talk about what we're dealing with here in the first episode. Now, first of all, you're going to have to excuse me if I don't get into a lot of the details of the plot of this episode. Unfortunately, trying to explain the plot line to an episode of the X-Files is usually only slightly less complicated than trying to explain to someone how to build a thermonuclear bomb. I mean, I could draw a chart and it would look more complicated than probably the D-Day invasion strategy. And I'm speaking of this as personal experience. When I was watching this show, I would at times the next day be talking about the show with somebody who, for whatever reason, had missed that episode and was trying to explain them what happened. And yeah, X-Files episodes are usually in many ways rather complicated ones. And this is actually, the pilot episode is actually a fairly straightforward X-Files story. And that's simply due to the fact that it has to set up so much stuff. It has to introduce us, of course, to our main characters and the world they live in and what the show is going to be about. So, of course, our two main characters with the X-Files are Fox Mulder, played by David Duchovny, and Dana Scully, played by Gillian Anderson. Now, the great thing about Mully and Scully is they really were one of the great, and forgive me for using this word, and I don't mean it quite in the shipper context, although that certainly does come into play with these characters, that they really were one of the great TV couples of the 90s. And one of the really great things about Scully and Mulder that made them work so well as characters was that they played into that key element of storytelling is in presenting contrast. Of course, you have the very basic male and female. You have Scully, the skeptic, versus Mulder, the believer. You have Scully, who's someone who puts a lot of stock in logic, while Mulder is someone who's willing to go with his hunches, follow his feelings on things. And so that right there created enormously good dynamics between the two characters. They were people who both, in terms of their personality, were able to complement each other and were able to frequently find themselves at odds with each other. And it's that dynamic, that clash, that made so much of the show great. And it was also great because they could present us with, generally two different theories about what was going on. Mulder would have his, crazy theory of the week, and then Scully would be there to offer the rational explanation. And of course, being the sort of show that it was, Mulder turned out to be right the majority of the time. But he wasn't, of course, always right, and even in those cases, Scully was still able to make very good, very reasonable, and often extremely critical observations. So one of the great strengths of the X-Files is that they were able to do that, to merge the fantastic and the rational, the mundane, so well. But anyway, a lot of that, of course, has to do with the performances of David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson as Mulder and Scully, respectively. Honestly, I'm really at a loss as to what I could possibly add to what has been said about these two and the show. This, for all its mythology, for all its crazy monsters and interesting stories and all this other stuff, at the end of the day, it really was Mulder and Scully that everyone was tuning in to see. Anderson and Duchovny just breathe these characters. Now, I'm not going to say that there weren't writing fumbles, that there weren't days when the actors were off and all that other good stuff. You know, no show is perfect, no actor is perfect, no script is perfect. But those two actors, they really just knocked those characters of Scully and Mulder out of the park. They really were some of the best written characters on 90s television. And I know that I'm looking back at the 90s through rose-colored glasses, nostalgia, and all that other fun stuff. But I do mean it when I say that. Scully and Mulder really were some of the strongest characters on 90s TV. But anyway, let's do briefly step in, talk about some more about what was set up in this episode. Of course, we do have the basics of the characters. We have Fox Mulder, aka Spooky Mulder, this incredibly intelligent, incredibly talented guy, but his obsession with the paranormal and bizarre things, particularly UFOs, has gotten him landed literally in the basement of the FBI, investigating the really weird, kooky cases, dubbed, of course, the X-Files, that nobody else in the Bureau wants to fiddle with. And we have Scully being brought in. And the great thing about how they started off with Scully and Mulder is that Scully is literally brought in to discredit Mulder. She's there to basically say, yeah, this guy's a complete and utter nut job. And of course, as we go along in this episode, and I could say a lot more about what happens in the greater storyline of the X-Files series as it goes along, but that is really sort of outside the scope of this review. So I might talk about that a little bit more about that later. We'll see. But anyways, as this episode wears on, Scully and Mulder are basically investigating the suspicious death of some teens in Oregon, or suspicious death of a teenager, and some weirds going on with some of her friends. The short version of what happens is that Mulder believes that alien abduction is involved, while Scully believes that there's something most likely involving a cult. Well, they poke around and a lot of crazy things happen, and at the end of it all, Scully is not, of course, converted to Mulder's line of thinking. If that was what would happen, then this would really have robbed the show of a lot of what made it great. However, Scully has seen enough things to be willing to at least give Mulder and his ideas a chance. She's not a convert to his crazy beliefs. She's not willing to just take anything that Mulder says at face value, but she is willing to consider what Mulder eventually and repeatedly during the series dubs extreme possibilities. And of course, and we also are introduced to other various elements of the ongoing mythology. One is, of course, that there is a great conspiracy to cover up what's going on out there in the world, of course, naturally with the aliens being the main one. We see for the first time that there are active forces in the government who are working to stop Scully and Mulder. These folks are, of course, embodied by the one and only cigarette-smoking man, aka Cancer Man, who we also see in this episode. He doesn't have any lines, he doesn't say anything, but he's there. And I was doing some reading about this, and apparently this character was really just intended as an extra. And he just ultimately ended up becoming an absolutely crucial portion of the X-Files mythology. So, that certainly is something. But anyway, um, getting back to this, while I was watching this, I was really taken back to when I first watched this episode back when it did originally aired. I do have some vague memories of actually watching this episode that first time. So there really was, as I said before, a great sense of nostalgia. I remember one thing that really struck me when I was watching this originally back in 1993 was being impressed that Scully had a cell phone. Now, this might seem absolutely extraordinary to some of the younger folks who might be watching this video, but believe it or not, folks, people did not always have cell phones. In fact, even having a cell phone in 1993 was rather unusual. Now, of course, at the time, I remember thinking, well, okay, Scully's an FBI agent. It sort of makes sense that she would have a cell phone. She's someone very important. And in addition, of course, to being an FBI agent, she's also a doctor. So again, it makes sense that she had a cell phone. But just a few years earlier on the show Saved by the Bell, when we saw Zach Morris pull out that cell phone, I'm sure I wasn't the only one who was like, really, like, ooh, he's got a cell phone? How cool. Because I guess that was what, 1990, 1991, a teenager with a cell phone was virtually unheard of if you weren't from a wealthy family in a major city like New York or LA or someplace like that. And this really here just goes to show you how much the world has changed in the last 20 years. Now everybody has a cell phone. They're everywhere. I was going to show you my phone, but apparently it's out of reach at the moment. So anyway, let's continue on. There's not really too much else that I can say about the plot without having to draw the big football play diagram to explain it all. Although I do have to echo the comment made by another reviewer I came across while I was doing some reading about this episode, where he points out that it was actually very silly to see them apparently hiding evidence of aliens in the coffin of a person who had died under mysterious circumstances. When, if they'd really wanted to keep something like that secret, a shallow grave in the woods would have proven infinitely more effective. That I hadn't really occurred to me. I don't think when any time that I'd seen that show, but that really is genuinely a very good observation. So I feel as a reviewer I should pass that on to you there. So let's move on. Let's talk really about the X-Files legacy, because that's really emotionally what comes to mind for me having watched this episode. Now, before I move on to this, let me get it out of the way that, one, this is a very good episode. In fact, it's probably one of the best pilot episodes for a science fiction TV series that I've seen since probably the first episode of Deep Space Nine, which actually it didn't have the greatest start in history, but it was certainly a much stronger start than the first episodes of something like Voyager or even Next Generation. And I say that as somebody who dearly, dearly loves Star Trek: The Next Generation. Voyager, they had their moments. They tried. But anyway, it is, as I said, an extremely strong pilot episode. We are introduced to our characters. We are introduced to their world. We are given strong performances. We are introduced to a strong mythology. And while there would be, honestly, the mythology of the X-Files is something that I could really talk about for a long, long time, so we're not going to get into that too much. But let me talk about the show's legacy, as I was saying. For those folks who just simply were too young or to really remember the 90s, it's really hard to imagine just how incredibly influential this show was back then. Now, the guy that created the show, Chris Carter, he said that he based it all on an old 70s TV show called Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was a show that was basically involved an investigative reporter who went around and would stumble into these very crazy, very creepy supernatural mysteries as he was going about it. And I've even seen a few episodes of this show back on the Sci-Fi Channel. Okay, and it is actually, for the time, not without its flaws, actually quite good. And you can definitely see how the X-Files is indeed its spiritual successor. But the X-Files, when it was on, it really was the first show to really take a lot of various elements and put them together in a package that really, really struck the viewers. The X-Files was one of those shows that really came along in the right way at the right time, had the right people behind it, and it just really turned into lightning in the bottle. There was a time in the 90s where every season you were going to see some sort of supernatural sci-fi investigation shows that were clearly intended as riffs on the X-Files. And of course, TV being TV, not many of those shows lasted very long. Anyone here ever actually watch an episode of Freaky Links? Yeah, that's what I thought. Well, anyway, but as I said, it really did come along at just the right time and struck just the right tone. And a lot of it was, you have to understand the dynamics of the time. In 1993, the Cold War had just recently ended, and this was something that had dominated the cultural and political landscape of really the world for almost 50 years. And in America, now that the Russians and communism and the Soviet Union didn't really, we knew that they really weren't that looming horrible threat. Well, people's fears, honestly, people's need to find an enemy, which I think is sadly kind of intrinsic to the human nature, it needed something else. And as we saw in the 90s, people tended to ultimately gravitate towards conspiracy theories, and at least in the US government as the source of the new adversary for people. And the X-Files really tapped into that. It really tapped into that sense of paranoia, of feeling that people were working against us. And this was just really due to the social changes that were happening in the 90s, of course. But when society does undergo major upheavals, when people are feeling uncertain, it is natural that they turn and try and find someone to blame it on. And of course, the government, for however true that might be, is of course everybody's favorite scapegoat. But anyway, let me get back to the X-Files legacy. The X-Files was really great in that it took, as I said, those elements of science fiction, of fantasy, of horror, and found that sweet spot where you blended them all together. That really strong mix of the fantastic and the mundane, of taking the world that we live in, the world that we know, the world that we're comfortable with, and introducing just enough of the other to make it intriguing, and of course, especially in the case of the X-Files, genuinely frightening. And of course, the X-Files, like all TV shows, it had its run. It eventually came to an end and all of that. But even though you might not see it, plastered boldly across the screen, the X-Files has really cast a very long shadow, left a very incredible legacy on modern television. I mean, look at shows like Lost or Fringe or Supernatural, and you can see the fingerprints of the X-Files on those shows. Now, please understand me. I'm not accusing those shows of ripping the X-Files off in any way. I'm not taking any kind of knocks at the people who made those shows or who write those shows. I'm not disparaging their creativity or their originality in any way, shape, or form. please understand that. What I am saying is that nothing is created in a vacuum. Everything takes influence from something. I remember reading years ago an interview with Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses, and somebody asked him a very standard question that people ask musicians, and that is, what are your influences? Pardon me a second. And Axl said quite simply, everything is an influence. Now, to illustrate that, think about how much Star Trek and Star Wars have influenced science fiction. Now, you can make a big long list of all the influences. I mean, if you've been watching my videos, I even talked several times about the influences of Star Trek on the Green Lantern, the animated series that I've been reviewing. But the thing is that I'm saying here is that influence does not necessarily mean that the people who make the show just took stuff from that show, filed the serial numbers off, slapped a fresh coat of paint, new names on the characters, and threw it out there on television. Not that this, of course, hasn't happened many, many times in television, but the X-Files has that legacy, that influence in that it came onto there, and it did have that very strong stench. I'm sorry, stench. A little bit of irony there for some of the really bad episodes. Oh boy, were there some bad episodes. But anyway, it did have that feeling of a very powerful overarching mythology. Now, granted, that overarching mythology didn't quite come to fruition as well as the fans may have hoped, to put it mildly, but we're not going to get into that. It's outside the scope of this review. But doing that in that way, you can see quite a lot of other shows have done that. I think Lost is probably the big modern example. I mean, look how many shows after Lost came out and tried to go with that Lost vibe. Well, folks, that is exactly what happened in the 90s with the X-Files. I'm sure if you think about it, you can probably think of maybe half a dozen shows that tried to, ride the Lost bandwagon. Okay, so you understand what I'm saying there. And of course, the whole marriage of the mundane and the fantastic. I think from what I've seen of it, that Fringe is in many ways the most successful, the most I really don't want to use this word, but it's the best one I can think of, the most true successor to the X-Files. Although you can, as I said before, I think Supernatural is another show that takes a strong influence. Now, of course, there is no question in Supernatural as to whether or not monsters are real and all that other stuff. But I think that dynamic between Sam and Dean certainly bears more than a little influence from the dynamic between Scully and Mulder. So let me start wrapping this up. The great thing, while this first pilot episode is a very strong, and as I said, one of the best pilot episodes for a sci-fi show that I have ever seen, while it has both great actors and great writing and all that other fun stuff, the real strength of this show is that it opens the door. It opens the door to a show that, while flawed, was one of the best written, best acted TV shows of its time. A show that left a tremendous legacy, created a tremendous influence. And while it had its time, and since X-Files has left the air, of course, a new generation of science fiction and fantasy fans have risen, there is still a great deal that I think younger, modern fans would get out of this show if they were willing to just go out and give it a try. Yeah, you know what? I actually had a little bit of a rant I was going to go off on, but you know what? I'm not going to go there. So what I'm going to say here is, if you are familiar with the show, if you're like me, take the time to go back and have another look at this show. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by how well it really does hold up. And if X-Files is something that you're not really familiar with, don't let the fact that it's a little bit old turn you off. I mean, Shakespeare is over 400 years old, and it is still enormously influential, enormously entertaining, and enormously beloved by people centuries after it was written. And while The X-Files is certainly not Shakespeare, it is indeed very good television. So, as I was saying, don't let the fact that it's a little old turn you off. Go and give it a try. I think you'll genuinely be pleasantly surprised. Anyway, folks, that's all I have for this one. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.